People love to say that modern comic book creators, most of this is aimed at writers, just aren't very good anymore. That something is lacking in the quality of their work. And that has led me to wondering not only who the top tier writers are in comics, but are there any? Are there writers who stand above the pack as being some of the best that the industry has to offer? Or are we in a downswing on the writing side of things? And for the sake of this conversation, certainly we're talking about the industry at large, but I would really love to focus more on the big two, just because I feel like when this criticism is lobbed, it's generally in the direction of big two comics, so Marvel and DC.
And we should also solidify this is in 2024. So if you're watching this, read the little date at the bottom.
Uh, I'll start with DC because I have a strong feeling out of the gate that may be surprising coming out of me. Tom King.
Yeah, yeah. Premier, I feel like guy on the who like came on the come up and taken large books, obscure characters, and done things with them in a format that really works for him. That makes a lot of sense. Tom King, I think, is quickly became and rocketed to become a name in comics, and was handed the keys to Batman at some point. Like that is a marker for success.
Well, I think Cale bringing up Tom King is salient too, because like it's almost like event viewing. You know, it doesn't hit for
Yeah.
all of us at every point, but when there's like a new Tom King 12-issue maxi series out, people are they're listening is the word I came up with, even though it's reading. But they're tuned in for that announcement.
They pay attention.
Yeah, or when Tom King teases a new book, then people are like, "Oh, I wonder what that is." There's always discourse around it, and I think most people understand like not everything is for me by him, but when there are stuff that is for me, that shit hits.
I think Ram V is somebody who is more recently getting handed a lot of big name books, the Swamp Thing, some work on Carnage, some of the Venom pieces. So existing in that sandbox and slowly getting elevated into different books, and now he's on New Gods, and I think there's a lot of trust in him as a writer, and he has a lot of capability, and so he's definitely a name that I think is a top creator when I think of either Marvel or DC, and that extends to his indie stuff in particular as well.
Well, let's establish some things and sort of widen the scope before we get into the exact specific creators. The question of, are there top tier creators in comics? I think we would all agree that the answer is yes to that. But weighing that against other eras and different time periods in comics, you talk about somebody like Rom V, you know, Rom could tell stories in any era, but does that elevate him to the guy whose books are always going to sell, to the guy who can take a character that people care about or don't and make them a seller of comics? Tom King can do that.
Mm.
Tom King, his Wonder Woman run right now, that book being one of the top 50-ish bestsellers, maybe it's doing even better than that. That is a borderline miracle for that character. So that's the Tom King effect on that book, and I think that's kind of where my mind goes when we talk about top tier creators. Can you sell to the audience? The books could be good, they could be trash. Can you sell?
I think it's tricky because back in when people are harkening back to the good old days when talking about like top tier creators, people always bring up like, oh, there's no Stan Lee anymore. Like that's drastic, but at that point that's because they can stay in comics and that was their thing. Like a lot of creators now have outside influence that maybe they want to go to TV, maybe they want to go somewhere else. There's more opportunity there, so the creators that do stay lead to books that also sell. I know we've talked about it on the show before, but Al Ewing on Immortal Hulk, that made Hulk one of the best-selling books in comics at the time. And I think Al Ewing's kind of established himself as a guy that can do that. in comics. You know, he has absolute Green Lantern coming up. Green Lantern probably hasn't sold as well as it did when Jeff Johns was on the book, but that was a top tier creator at the time. So we'll see where that goes. Yeah.
I think Al Ewing's a perfect candidate for Immortal Hulk specifically. Like, there aren't very many Hulk stories, that you can count that are, phenomenal and long lasting that outsold Batman.
Yeah.
I think Al Ewing's a perfect candidate for this.
And I think, another one that jumps out to me is, Kelly Thompson. Look at where Scarlet, I know we're talking about big two, but look at where Scarlet, a G.I. Joe book, look how well that sold. I think that has to do a little bit with Kelly Thompson's name being on the book. But now Kelly Thompson is writing Wonder Woman, launching a whole new universe. Like, that's a big deal, and you need top tier creators on it, and that's why Kelly Thompson is on a book like that.
She's getting the opportunity with Birds of Prey, I think has proven her capability, and I feel like that's been almost universal. She's been lauded for that book, and well deserved.
See, but I don't look at Kelly Thompson and say this is a person whose name brand and name recognition makes people buy the comic. I think Kelly Thompson is arguably in the top 5 best writers in comics, but that doesn't mean the same thing as this person can bring the boys to the yard, and put a book in that upper echelon of sales. And that's what I'm harking on.
Mount Rushmore right now.
I think she's making a case to beat somebody out.
I'd make the case that if that is the metric that we're basing things on, it's few and far between right now.
Therein lies the point.
I think it like now, like even if you try to think back, let's go 15, 20 years. Like, is it Bendis? Sure. But is it Hickman? Maybe. Some of his books were a little obtuse, and I don't think every book sold crazy. S.H.I.E.L.D. wasn't like the charts up. So I think you could even argue whether or not he was considered top tier in terms of sales.
At that time, but he was a newcomer to the big two.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, he was doing some stuff in Image and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think now it's more top tier characters, and that leads to sales. But I don't think there's anyone really lighting up the charts right now.
Not in the same way. It's not to make that comparison.
Yeah.
So I have Jonathan Hickman. There's no question. We pay the Hickman tax for a reason. Go ahead.
Is that because he's writing Ultimate Spider-Man? Because Gods didn't light up the charts.
All right. But you have over a decade of history with Jonathan Hickman selling amazing. Are we ignoring Krakoa? I don't feel like I need to go on. Hickman's books sell. We pay the Hickman tax. He's up there in that conversation. Donny Cates is another one. Yes, right now he is, MIA, but I guarantee you, whatever book it is that he ends up tackling when he returns is going to be huge because people are waiting for him. They want his voice in comics. I think another one is, and I sort of don't even want to say this necessarily, but given how big he is, or given how many big books he gets, I would even have to kind of tip my hat to Jed McKay. He's Marvel's anointed guy.
But then is that because he's writing Avengers and X-Men? Like, those are books that will be on the top of the charts no matter who's writing it. Because you don't care much for Avengers. I think it's okay.
I don't, but as we understand, I'm not the barometer of quality, right? And I think Tom King, again, to say his name again, he absolutely belongs in that conversation. He's going to get on a book that wouldn't even exist if he didn't want to write it. And it's going to do numbers. And it's all relative. I'm not saying that you have to be able to take, in the case of Tom King, somebody like What did he just do? Jenny Sparks?
Yeah.
To take Jenny
Sure,
Sparks
yeah.
and make Jenny Sparks a top 10 seller, that's not going to happen. But if you can take a character like Jenny Sparks and get that book over and people to buy it, to me, that speaks to a lot. Because, yeah, Tom King's name is not on Batman, but it doesn't need to be. It's on Wonder Woman, and it's making that book sell, whereas it wasn't before.
Could this conversation could these factors go around like, does the creator transcend the character? So in the case of like Tom King's Wonder Woman versus Avengers by Jed McKay.
That's kind of where my brain goes to it. Yeah, it's Tom. It's like the additive of Tom King's Wonder Woman, where it just so happens to be that Jed McKay is on Avengers. I could look at Jed McKay's Doctor Strange right now, and that's how I just said it. Jed McKay's Doctor Strange, even without thinking about it.
But I would say Blood Hunt by Jed McKay. Like,
well, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay. So then I would say by that logic, Amazing Spider-Man it's essentially immaterial who the names are on the book. Well, I wouldn't say that Junior's name, John Romita Jr.'s name being on it is immaterial. I think there are a lot of people who bought it for that, but maybe not for Zeb Wells. Like, you could like the story. Yes. I enjoyed a lot, but I didn't say, oh my God, they got Zeb Wells, I have to read this.
Yeah. I'm reading it, whoever's on the book. Like, that's Spider-Man for me, you know?
And I think, especially with characters like Spider-Man, I think Batman's like this. The arc is what will define that creator's run. Dan Slott's superior Spider-Man.
It's hard to look at it in the present tense. Like, sure, we can look at who the blockbuster creators and books are right now. I think that's fine. But to add the qualifier of top, that seems like a thing that needs time on it.
But this is the moment where we're having the conversation.
Yeah, well, and I guess to that, right? It's and using that previous analogy, I would say it's Chip Zdarsky's Daredevil versus he's currently writing Batman. Like, he hasn't reached that pinnacle yet with that character, but he has hit those high highs with Daredevil. And I think it comes down to how you're playing in the sandbox you're provided. And in that case, he makes more of a mark for Daredevil than he does Batman currently.
I think from a marketing standpoint, you could look at Jed McKay and be like, oh, okay, this guy is making us money, sure. But in my eyes, I do like Jed McKay's books. I can't see him as a top creator. Like, that's a hard pill to swallow for me.
You know what's funny? I feel that way about Donny Cates.
But his name sells, and that's not. And I think that's undeniable.
Sure. I'd also say Donny Cates is very good about marketing himself as a person. Same with Chip. Sure. Those are outliers in the industry because they are essentially characters in a way.
But the thing is that when you observe the conversation around Donny Cates, you can clearly see that people love his storytelling. People are very invested in the stories that he tells, and the sales reflect that. So to me, he's Teflon when it comes to that. Like, you could hate his guts, not that anybody does or feels that way, but like, you could, but that wouldn't negate the fact that by Marvel's perspective and by the fans' perspective who are buying his books, Donny Cates is the guy.
Top tier.
And I would put Jed McKay in that same camp, because it doesn't matter what I say. People continue to buy the man's books, and Marvel continues to give him the books that are the signifiers of who they think is at the tippy top.
This not to bring up a wrestling analogy, but this helps me. I guess the way I'm trying to digest this discussion is in a wrestling term. You have top guys who might not, like Jinder Mahal was a top guy at one point. He was WWE champion. Did I like him? Did I think he was very good? Not necessarily, but he was a top guy, and I think he was probably bringing them in money from other markets. That was the objective. So I guess maybe top guy is more of a less of a tastemaker thing and more of just a factual thing.
That's exactly what I'm trying to get at. Okay. That this is a conversation that we can have that doesn't really involve opinion, because some people sell more than others. And again, it is valid to say, well, Jed McKay has Avengers, but I counter and say, well, why does he? Why does he have Avengers? Why does he have X-Men? Why does he have Bloodhunt? Why is he the one that they allowed to kill Doctor Strange? Why? I think the reason is the same reason that Brian Michael Bendis was allowed to do what he was allowed to do. Because whether you like him or not, the books that he does sell.
They're going to say because Hickman's busy.
Been there, done that, and they Marvel doesn't want to pay the Hickman tax anymore for that.
I think we're in a. I don't want to keep pushing back. We've already been long on this, but I think with like someone like McKay, can he put in a script on time? Can they pay him a amount that makes sense to Marvel that they can't pay people who might be considered top creators elsewhere? I think comics is in a bit of a Marvel specifically is in a different time than it was during Bendis.
Well, but again, like if they're doing that, if they're paying him, if they're taking his scripts, late or not, they think he's worth it.
He might not be the top guy in our eyes, but he is the guy for Marvel.
He's Marvel's top guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if you were putting together a list of the top 5 writers at Marvel based on performance, if you didn't have Jed McKay on it, you would be wrong. Because it's based in fact.
Yep, based on performance of sales. Yes, you are right.
And he didn't just get it's not like he fell out of the sky and was gifted Avengers and all these other books. He's been grinding.
Yeah, works his way up.
He's put his time in.
There's no world where Black Cat and Mary Jane like didn't sell well. Like it sold well because it was a good book. Like in that sense, like that book doesn't always do well.
The quality would that's a good point. So maybe you could say X-Men, who cares? It doesn't matter. It's X-Men. But you wouldn't be able to say Mary Jane, Black Cat, who cares? Though, in order for that book to sell, something has to be connecting with the audience or it would just not sell and it would get canceled. So he's doing something right. And I've been saying it for years. I don't care about any of it. But it's true. He's doing something that's connecting. So, go ahead.
I'm just trying to see if I could see anyone else in that sort of similar situation. Like, Jed McKay's trajectory at Marvel is clear. Like, no-name book to Avengers. Like, you can see that. I don't know if I can say that same about anyone else, really.
Yeah. I mean, Zeb Wells is, Spider-Man's top book.
Yeah.
But Zeb Wells has been around forever, The book he did before that was X-Men book. That was really good. With the bad guys on it. Hellions. Hellions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. People like Hellions. People like Jed McKay's voice.
I would argue Gillen in that case because he was handed the keys to the X-Men stuff post Hickman. They entrust that to him, whether or not we liked some of the particulars there.
I think my sort of final thought on this is there are top tier creators in comics. But I also think that if the scope is limited to the big 2, there are less of them than there were 15 years ago. And I think that there's a multifaceted reason for that. A lot of it has to do with the ability to go and make money in comics elsewhere in the medium. So if you were to stretch back 10 years ago, right, or 12 years ago, and I asked the same question, your list would include people like Rick Remender. It would include people like Ed Brubaker, probably, Matt Fraction, and, people of that ilk. They're all gone. Not from comics, but from the big 2. Yeah. And so who replaced them over these last few years is people like, again, Joshua Williamson is definitely in that conversation, Hickman, Cates, etc. But I think there's less names. And I think that outside of the literal, tippy top of that, they probably don't carry as much weight as they used to.
We had to go to Avengers to get that name.
Yeah, you could... Go ahead, Cale. Go ahead.
I would put it the other way around. They had to go to Avengers to get that name. Whereas, Fraction made Hawkeye.
Sure. Sure. That's a great point. I would say that probably each of those creators that we would have been talking about a decade plus ago have a book like that.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's true. And where they are now is where there's more money.
For
And
them.
their status and the way that we talk about them is commiserate with all of that great work that they did that now stands alongside Titans. It isn't as if before Ed Brubaker and the various amazing artists that he worked with got to Captain America, that was the hottest book. It wasn't. He made it that. They made it that. And I think that is what a top tier creator can do. And by the way, we're not saying that like Kelly Thompson, Rom V aren't going to reach that status. Not by any means. I don't even know that their best work has already been read. I'm just saying that at this present moment, I don't feel like they've achieved that status quite yet, but there is a possibility.
I would also say that the nature of the industry doesn't facilitate that anymore. It doesn't facilitate people to have long runs. It doesn't facilitate them to spend their time there when they can do a creator-owned book where they have more money from it, where they can go to TV, which is big now because that was sequential storytelling that didn't really exist 20 years ago, as prevalent as it does now in terms of like, it was just HBO back then. Now there's more room for it everywhere. Is it all good? Different discussion. But money can come from different locations now, that spending all that time on a book to do your grand epic that people remember, I'm not sure it's really there for creators.
Immortal Hulk, man.
Outlier, and it worked out.
If it sells, it will sell. And Marvel and DC aren't telling anybody to go fuck off if their numbers are competing with the biggest books around.
Yep.
So to me, the next Immortal Hulk is always around the corner, and what makes that happen is us and saying, "Oh wow, this is hot. This is a book we got to get," and then we get that big run. Who knows where Immortal Thor is going to end up? You know, he says 50. Tom King says he's going to do 100 on Wonder Woman.
You love that announcement.
Yeah, big fan of that. But we'll leave the final decisions on all of this up to you guys. In your opinion, who are the top tier creators in comics? Do you even agree with the parameters that we laid out? And of course, do you think that there are top tier creators in comics at all? That last bit, I know there are some of you who will absolutely say there aren't. We'll leave that conversation for another video. Until then, thank you so much. We'll see you in the next one.